So it's my pleasure to introduce Lee Pollock. Lee is an acclaimed writer, historian, and public speaker on the life and times of Winston Churchill. His writings about Churchill have appeared in the Wall Street Journal and many other publications, and he has appeared on CBS and the BBC in the United States and Britain, as well as other media outlets. He has spoken about Churchill's legacy and leadership at the U.S. House of Representatives, the Pentagon, the U.S. Supreme Court, and at many leading universities. He is a trustee, advisor to the board, and member of the operating committee of the International Churchill Society. He previously served as the Society's executive director. A native of Montreal and Canada, he is a graduate of McGill University and holds a master's degree from the University of Chicago. And so as I introduce Lee, I want to point out to you that behind him is an image of Churchill and a couple of sculptures, which he may talk a little bit more about, and some of Churchill's favorite beverages, which I just learned this evening include scotch. So thank you very much, Lee, for joining us, and we have a virtual round of applause as you begin.
Thank you, Kristen. And as you pointed out, Winston Churchill enjoyed alcohol. He once said, "I have taken more out of alcohol than alcohol has taken out of me." His favorite champagne was Paul Roger, which is right there behind me. He drank Johnny Walker Scotch. The portrait of Churchill is one of my favorites. It's a charcoal sketch of him in the 1920s. So there we have it. So thanks for that nice introduction and for arranging the program tonight. And more importantly, a special thank you, to Lynn, the library director, your colleagues and your board for continuing to make this library a vital and vibrant part of the Wood River Valley. In this very historic
Lee, excuse me. Something has happened to your microphone and it suddenly went very scratchy. No, it's not. Like a good friend of mine says, it's always something that happens. I don't know what happened. It was perfectly clear, and then all of a sudden it got very scratchy and distorted.
Is that better?
Much better. Thank you.
All right, there we go. Okay. As I was saying, making this library such a vibrant and vital part of the Wood River Valley is no mean task in this very historic year. Winston Churchill was a man of words, both spoken and written. He once said the following: "Words are the only things that last forever. The pyramids may molder, bridges rust, canals fill up, but words remain with us, not as relics of the past, but with all their pristine and vital force." I can't help wondering what Winston Churchill would think of the words we're hearing during this, our election year. Well, words are important and they flourish in public libraries like this. I'm pleased to be a member of the Friends of the Haley Public Library, and you should be too, especially if you enjoy tonight's program, which is free, I might add. Membership begins at only $5 a year, and Sir Winston has personally told me he'll be very disappointed if you don't think a program about him is worth at least that much. So go to haleypubliclibrary.org, click on the donate link on the right side, and please join. It's very easy to find. So tonight I'll be talking to you about two iconic families of the 20th century, and particularly their patriarchs, Winston Churchill and Averell Harriman. You probably know something or perhaps a fair amount about Winston Churchill, but I suspect that the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the name Averell Harriman is he founded Sun Valley. Without that, of course, many of us might not be here, but I think his life is very interesting in its own right and deserves our attention. So let's start with the early years of these two men, beginning with Churchill. Both he and Harriman were aristocrats, albeit in different ways. Winston Churchill was born here at Blenheim Palace, the grandson of the great Duke of Marlborough. His own father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising member of Parliament, soon to enter the cabinet. And his mother was a beautiful American-born heiress from Brooklyn, New York, Jennie Jerome. She would turn out to be an important influence in her young son's life for much of his early years. As a child, Winston Churchill's academic record was spotty, though he did excel in things that interested him, especially history and not surprisingly English. He attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, and after being commissioned as a second lieutenant, began a military career that took him to Cuba, India, the Sudan, and most famously to South Africa. He established himself as a war correspondent and writer, and his sensational exploits in South Africa earned him a seat in Parliament in 1900 and launched a political career that would last some 60 decades. He abandoned the Conservative Party for the Liberals in 1904, and by 1911, aged just 37, he was First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the world's greatest navy. Churchill's career over the next 2 decades was a combination of accomplishment, failure, and recovery. He actually thought his political career was over at just age 40 when he was blamed for the failure of the Gallipoli campaign during the First World War. But he soon recovered, and from 1917 to 1922, served in several important cabinet positions, culminating in the post of Chancellor of the Exchequer. This is one of my favorite images of Churchill and his family from that time. But his political career took an unwelcome turn in May 1929 when he lost office with the defeat of the Conservative government. Thus began his famous wilderness years, when he was the most prominent voice warning the Western democracies of the danger of Adolf Hitler and the rising Nazi dictatorship. Churchill spent much of that decade at his beloved country home, Chartwell in Kent. This is one of my favorite images of Churchill and his family. And if you look at the man with the considerable tan on the right, that is none other than Charlie Chaplin. He and the Churchill family were quite friendly, and that's an interesting story, which perhaps I'll tell you on another occasion. So now let's talk about Averell Harriman. He was born in New York City in November 1891, 17 years after Churchill. His father was this man, E.H. Harriman, a prominent business figure who was then building a railroad empire that would span the country. After taking control of the Union Pacific Railroad in 1901, Harriman waged an epic battle for control of the Northern Pacific, which became one of the most celebrated events in the age of the great robber barons. He became one of the country's wealthiest men, but also most vilified, especially after he had a spectacular falling out with a former friend, President Theodore Roosevelt. For many years, his controversial reputation lingered over his son. In particular, he was pilloried in the press. This image from the Pictorial press shows him gobbling up the railroads of America, and another one entitled The Spyder and the Fly. E.H., as he was known, was a strong-minded father who impressed on his son the virtues of an athletic life, strong nerve, hard work, and public service. E.H. once declared, quote, "Great wealth is an obligation. Whatever you have to do, you should try to improve it." That gospel of hard work was ingrained in Averell Harriman at an early age. Averell Harriman attended the Groton School, this is him on the crew team, where he followed in the footsteps of another New York aristocrat, Franklin Roosevelt. His father died when Averell was only 17, leaving him the heir to an immense fortune. He continued on to Yale and then joined the Union Pacific upon graduation. But he still felt overshadowed by his father's reputation, and in 1917 left the railroad and bought a rundown shipyard in Philadelphia. In the booming American economy of the Roaring '20s, Averell Harriman spread his wings. By 1920, he was one of the most powerful men in the shipping industry, and also returned to his father's roots on Wall Street, forming an investment firm with his younger brother Roland. That soon became Brown Brothers Harriman, and one of the original partners was a man named Prescott Bush, later a United States Senator from Connecticut, but eventually more famous as being the father and the grandfather of two presidents. As the 1920s unfolded, Harriman enjoyed an active life, both personal and professional. He sold his shipping interests and rejoined the Union Pacific, not surprisingly as chairman of the board. He invested in a Russian mining concession, which led in 1926 to a historic 4-hour meeting with Leon Trotsky, who had not yet been exiled, let alone murdered as he was to be by Joseph Stalin. It was the beginning of Harriman's lifelong interest in the Soviet Union. In his personal life, Averell Harriman epitomized glamour and wealth. He was handsome, 6 feet 1 inches tall, a top-ranked polo player, a champion skier, who married twice and had 2 daughters. He maintained several homes, including a Gatsby-like estate on Long Island, where he was known to have a killer instinct on the croquet court. In his spare time, he operated one of the country's most prominent racing stables. This is him in the 1930s at Belmont Park, New York. And then in the mid-1930s, he famously hired an Austrian count, Felix Schaftgotsch, to find a location for America's first destination ski resort. That story is probably familiar to you, and without the count and Averell Harriman, I might be speaking today at the public library in Aspen. Perish the thought. You've probably also seen this wonderful classic image of Averell Harriman on what must have been a warm day on the slopes in Sun Valley, or perhaps they didn't have puffy coats in those days. But with all this, Averell Harriman's instincts and interests gradually turned to public life, especially after the onset of the Great Depression and the election of his fellow New Yorker, Franklin Roosevelt. Harriman had been a traditional Republican, but in 1928, he voted for the Democratic candidate, Governor Al Smith. Harriman's turn away from the Republican Party was influenced by his sister Mary, who was a close friend of Roosevelt's Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins. Years later, Harriman noted, quote, "I've had a lot more fun out of life since I've become a Democrat." This is a nice image of Harriman and Franklin Roosevelt in the early 1930s. Roosevelt's New Deal fundamentally altered the country, and the federal government sought out men with connections in the business world, but who would embrace political change. Washington attracted Averell Harriman's interest, and along the way, he came close to buying what was then the bankrupt Washington Post. He was beaten out by another financier, Eugene Mayer. 30 years later, Mayer's daughter became the Post publisher. Her name was Katharine Graham, and she remained a powerful force in American journalism until she died in 2001, coincidentally, right here in Sun Valley. In January 1934, Harriman took his first real government job, moving to Washington to become a senior administrator at the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. The Supreme Court ruled the NRA unconstitutional a few years later, but there was no doubt that Averell Harriman's future no longer lay in New York City. In the summer of 1940, after Germany had swept through Europe, he took over part of a new Office of Production Management, which was created to mobilize American resources to support beleaguered Britain. It was a fitting choice since Harriman, in contrast to isolationists in much of the Republican Party, had become an outspoken advocate of American assistance to Britain. He told the president's leading advisor, Harry Hopkins, quote, "Our national policy should be to help the Allies in every way short of war." Harriman had met Harry Hopkins early in the New Deal, and the two men had grown close, fueled by similar personalities and Hopkins' fascination with Harriman's lifestyle and his wide circle of prominent friends. This was a relationship that would soon catapult Averell Harriman into the most exciting adventure of his life and set him on the path to become one of the most important and enduring American diplomats of the 20th century. As the year 1941 dawned, Britain was in trouble. Nazi bombers were blitzing London and other cities night after night. Despite its valiant spirit, the island nation was struggling to carry on. On January 5th, Franklin Roosevelt announced that he was sending Harry Hopkins to meet Churchill in London and see what it would take to keep Britain in the war. The United States would still remain neutral, but become, quote, the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it, through a new program known as Lend-Lease, which distributed war material to nations who were, quote, vital to the defense of the United States. Harry Hopkins returned to Washington with a positive report after 6 weeks in Britain, but the president realized he needed a man on the ground to shepherd the program. Roosevelt called Harriman to the White House and gave him this assignment, quote, recommend everything that we can do short of war to keep the British Isles afloat. Harriman would report directly to Roosevelt and departed for London on March 10th. When he arrived 5 days later, he was immediately whisked away to meet the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. Churchill and Harriman had actually met twice before, once in 1927 in France, when Harriman called on Churchill for his opinion about the business climate in Russia. And then the second time in New York in 1929, when Churchill was staying with his longtime friend, another financier, Bernard Baruch. But this time, Harriman was meeting Churchill at a moment when Britons held Americans in diminished esteem, thanks to the recently departed Ambassador Joseph P. Kennedy. Kennedy was thought to be a Nazi sympathizer, but at the very least, a strong proponent of appeasement. It was up to the new ambassador, John Gilbert Wynant, to mend the relationship on the diplomatic front. But as the Lend-Lease expediter, Averell Harriman could show the British people the kind of tangible support that they needed and that America was willing to provide. Harriman quickly found there was no reason to worry that Kennedy had done permanent damage. As soon as he arrived, Churchill told him, quote, we accept you as a friend. Nothing will be kept from you. Harriman was soon dining with Churchill at least once a week and spent 7 of his first 8 weekends in England with the Prime Minister and his family. Churchill also invited him to attend meetings of the War Cabinet, unprecedented for a foreigner. The two men spent many hours talking late into the night at number 10 Downing Street, where Churchill would summon Harriman from his lodgings at the Dorchester Hotel for conversations over cigars, I suspect some alcohol, and Winston Churchill's favorite card game called Bezique. The Prime Minister spoke freely about sensitive matters and sought Harriman's opinion as he pondered war strategy. Harriman wrote home to his wife Marie in New York, telling her, quote, I think Churchill likes me because I am blunt and outspoken on every subject. Even if he doesn't agree, he likes the stimulation of different ideas. Marie Harriman could have joined Averell in London, but decided to remain in New York because of problems with her eyesight. However, another Harriman was soon to make her way across the Atlantic. This was Averell's 23-year-old daughter, Kathy, a recent graduate of Bennington College. She was smart, daring, and craved adventure. While Kathy and her father had not been close when she was growing up, they eventually became good friends, in particular because of Sun Valley. When Kathy was in college, she spent every holiday working for Averell at Sun Valley, where she became a world-class skier, but also a friend of her father's. Someone referred to her as his ablest lieutenant. With Harry Hopkins' help, she finagled a visa to join her father in London, working as a war correspondent for Newsweek magazine. This is an early picture of her doing exactly that. When Kathy arrived in London, she too was whisked away to meet Churchill. She wrote home to her sister, quote, "It's rather a shock meeting someone you've seen caricatured so many times." He was smaller than she had anticipated and, quote, "a lot less fat." But he was even more impressive than she had imagined. She said, quote, "I'd expected an overpowering, rather terrifying man, but he's quite the opposite, very gracious. He has a wonderful smile and isn't hard to talk to at all." One day, Kathy met a battle-scarred RAF pilot who was only one of 2 men surviving in his squadron. She wrote her sister, quote, "He showed me something he carries with him to cheer him up when he feels he can't go on any longer." Kathy continued, "It's Churchill's bit about the RAF. Never in the history of the world has so much been owed by so many to so few." Kathy Harriman had clearly become a big fan of Winston Churchill. The two families were soon fast friends. Clementine Churchill played croquet with Averell, and Kathy became close to the Churchill daughters, especially Sarah, who was 26, and 18-year-old Mary, both of whom were serving in uniform. Kathy became even closer to Pamela, Winston Churchill's daughter, married to his only son, Randolph. A year younger than Kathy, Pam was a fellow resident of the Dorchester Hotel, and she charmed and enchanted every man she met. Kathy thought she was great fun, praising her as, quote, "one of the wisest girls I've ever met." Winston Churchill was so fond of Averell Harriman that he asked him to serve as his representative on a tour of the Mideast to assess supply needs. That technically fell under Averell's Lend-Lease mandate, but in this case, he was actually representing Britain, not the United States. Churchill even arranged for his son Randolph, who was based in Cairo, to be Harriman's guide. Randolph wrote back to his father, quote, "I have been tremendously impressed by Harriman and can well understand the regard you have for him. He has definitely become my favorite American." Randolph also made another observation, quote, "He clearly regards himself more as your servant than Roosevelt's. I do hope you will keep him at your side, as I think he is the most objective of all those people who are around you." And then he continued, "I found him absolutely charming. He spoke delightfully about you, and I fear I may have a serious rival." Randolph Churchill could not have realized the irony of that remark. The friendship between the Churchills and the Harrimans had complicated their professional relationship, and Randolph did not realize that they had also become entangled romantically. Averell Harriman first met Pamela at Chequers, the British Prime Minister's country residence, 2 weeks after he arrived in England. While Pamela was not classically beautiful, her round face, red-haired image radiated with life and sensuality. Pamela, it turned out, was to have numerous paramours, including famed CBS radio correspondent Ed Murrow, his boss, CBS's chief executive Bill Paley, and multimillionaire American Jock Whitney. With his black hair, tan skin, and athletic physique, Averell was, quote, "the most beautiful man that Pamela had ever seen." He was 49 and she was just 21, but one night they found themselves together at a dinner in the Dorchester Hotel when suddenly a massive German air raid exploded around them. Pamela took refuge in Harriman's third-floor suite. The next day, Averell wrote a letter to his wife Marie in New York describing the bombing. Needless to say, he wrote ambiguously, "My sleep was intermittent." Before long, the affair between Averell Harriman and Pamela Churchill had become an open secret, although they hid behind the pretense that Pamela was spending so much time with the Harrimans because she and Kathy were friends. And luckily for Averell, his daughter was the perfect cover, especially once the Harrimans moved into their own flat and Pamela moved in with them. Kathy soon found out that her father and her friend were having an affair, but decided to look the other way. Like Kathy, Churchill's friend and cabinet minister Lord Beaverbrook knew about the affair, and he used it for Britain's gain. He knew that Randolph Churchill had racked up enormous gambling debts. Lord Beaverbrook agreed to pay them off in exchange for information that Pamela passed on to him about her conversations with Harriman. That was a keen insight into American attitudes towards the war. But no one was quite sure if Winston and his wife Clementine knew about the affair. It's hard to believe that they didn't, or at least suspected something, but only once did Winston Churchill give the slightest indication that he did. He told Pamela, quote, "You know, they're saying a lot of things about Averell and you." She replied that people had nothing better to do than gossip. Churchill replied, quote, "I quite agree," and then dropped the matter. And while the personal relationship between the Harrimans and the Churchills is interesting, the political significance of this wartime friendship is actually more important. Winston Churchill and Averell Harriman together personified the developing special relationship between Britain and America. It was not simply that Harriman oversaw the distribution of what in today's dollars would be the equivalent of $350 billion in Lend-Lease aid. But more than the ambassador in London or FDR himself, it was Averell Harriman who was the face of America in Britain during those first 3 years. And it was Harriman who was at Churchill's side during some of the most historic moments during that time. The longer they lived in Britain, the more the Harrimans felt themselves adrift between two sides of the Atlantic. And they found it increasingly difficult to sympathize with friends back home who wanted America to remain neutral. Kathy wrote back to her sister in New York, quote, "When will Americans understand it's their own skins, not just English ones, that they'll have to fight for?" She used the words they and their, referring to her own fellow citizens. This identity crisis was particularly obvious on a date that lives in infamy, December 7th, 1941, which happened to be Kathy Harriman's 24th birthday. The Churchills were hosting a birthday party for her that night at Chequers when a prime ministerial aide came in with an urgent message that the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. Both Churchill and Harriman long believed that American entry into the war was inevitable, and now at last it had happened. Britain was no longer going to be alone. Kathy watched as Churchill, quote, "danced a jig in his silk dragon print robe, while her father, Averell Harriman, stood by the fireplace with resigned but satisfied relief." Churchill later said of that night, quote, "I went to bed and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful." Curiously, the more history Averell Harriman experienced at Churchill's side, the less Franklin Roosevelt seemed to want his envoy to be part of these historic moments. Unlike many of the president's underlings, Harriman was able to operate independently because of his personal wealth and his pre-war prestige. And many around Roosevelt felt that Averell Harriman, a former Republican, was not 100% devoted to the Democratic Party agenda. One of the ways that Roosevelt tried to control Harriman was through access. At the Atlantic Charter Conference in August 1941, between Roosevelt and Churchill, Harriman had to ask the president for permission to attend multiple times before the president finally agreed. Later, when Churchill went to Moscow to meet with Stalin for the first time in person in August 1942, Harriman thought, understandably, that the United States should be represented. When FDR refused, Harriman went to Churchill and convinced him to tell the president that Churchill wanted Harriman at the meeting. Churchill happily obliged with the request, and FDR eventually relented. This is a famous image of Churchill, Harriman, Stalin, and Molotov at that meeting in Moscow in 1942. That trip to Moscow was a prelude for what was soon to come. Just over a year later, Harriman was recalled to Washington to be told there was an urgent ambassadorial post that Roosevelt needed to fill. Roosevelt asked him to become ambassador to the Soviet Union, and in October 1943, the Harrimans bid the Churchills farewell. Kathy decided she would go with her father, so she packed up their flat, resigned from Newsweek, and flew to Moscow, but not before she completed one last and very special errand. Averell Harriman was never one for emotional drama, so he dispatched Kathy to break off his affair with Pamela on his behalf. That happened, but he did make arrangements for her to receive a generous monthly allowance and also the title to his car to soften the blow. But even though they were now 1,500 miles apart, the Churchills and the Harrimans remained close throughout the rest of the war. They regularly exchanged letters, and Averell continued to see eye to eye with the prime minister, even more than he did with the president. Roosevelt believed that the Soviet Union would continue to be a key partner in peace as in war. But Averell Harriman's optimism about the alliance quickly faded once he witnessed firsthand what it was like to work with Stalin and his cronies. Harriman and Churchill also continued to make history together, including at the first meeting of the Big Three at the Tehran Conference in December 1943, another occasion on which Harriman had to convince Roosevelt to include him, despite the fact that he had more day-to-day interaction with the Soviets than any other American. And then Harriman joined the three Allied leaders once more at the famous Yalta Conference in February 1945. This is a picture of the Big Three there, of Harriman and the American diplomat Edward Stettinius on the way to Yalta in 1945, and Harriman and Harry Hopkins the same year on the British ship HMS Orion. On this occasion of the Yalta Conference, Roosevelt could certainly not exclude Harriman, as it was being held in the Soviet Union. And interestingly, Kathy Harriman was able to join her father there for what turned out to be somewhat of a reunion. Churchill brought his daughter Sarah as his aide, and Roosevelt followed suit and brought his daughter Anna to assist him. With these three sets of fathers and daughters gathered together at a great moment in 20th century history, the stage was set for an enthralling and exceptional moment in time. You can read about that more in a wonderful new book entitled The Daughters of Yalta by a fine young historian, Catherine Katz. She's provided me with lots of fascinating information about the Harriman and Churchill families during the war and at the Yalta Conference. Here are the three daughters, Sarah, Anna, and Kathleen, at Yalta in 1945. At Yalta, Averell Harriman was at the table as the Big Three wrestled for control over post-war Europe, particularly Poland, on which Stalin had set his sights. Harriman agreed with Churchill that Roosevelt had substantially underestimated what Stalin would do to secure his objectives, and in the end, they proved to be right. In the weeks and months that followed Yalta, the relationship between the three allies would quickly deteriorate, with Poland as the catalyst. Averell Harriman witnessed this firsthand in Moscow. When Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, Averell and Kathy Harriman had been in Europe for 4 years. Harriman agreed to remain in Moscow during the transition to the Truman administration, ultimately returning to New York in January 1946. But barely 3 months had passed when the new president called him to the White House. Truman needed a new ambassador to the United Kingdom, and Harriman agreed to take that job. When he returned to London in April 1946, much had changed, and Winston Churchill was no longer prime minister. The Conservatives had astonishingly been voted out of office in July 1945, and Clement Attlee's Labor Party was now in charge. One thing did remain the same, however, Averell Harriman's friendship with Winston Churchill. One bright September afternoon that year, the two men were having lunch together when the telephone rang. The butler announced that President Truman was on the line. While they waited for the connection to be put through, Churchill asked Harriman what he supposed the president was calling about. It turned out there had been a falling out between Truman and his Commerce Secretary, the former Vice President Henry Wallace, and Harriman suspected that his name might be on the short list for that position. From London to Moscow and back again to London, Harriman had spent the last 5 years at the epicenter of power as it shifted across the globe to the United States. In those 5 years, Winston Churchill had been a constant presence in his life. He asked Churchill if Truman were to offer him the job, what he should do. Absolutely accept, Churchill said. The center of power is now in Washington. Indeed, Harry Truman did want Harriman to be his next Secretary of Commerce. So finally, he was going home for good at long last. After 5 years fighting in war and for peace side by side, it was now time for Harriman and Churchill to part. Averell Harriman now for the first time held cabinet rank as the new administration's voice to the business community. Ironically, some businessmen thought he was tainted by the liberal policies of the Roosevelt administration, while some in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, yes, they had such a wing even in those days, thought he was too close to Wall Street. One of the highlights of what turned out to be his brief tenure at the Commerce Department was a nasty run-in with a new young Republican member of Congress, Richard Nixon. Nixon had unfairly smeared a Commerce Department employee as a communist, and Harriman despised the future president forever after. The other major event in Harriman's life in this time was his chairmanship of a blue ribbon committee to assess the needs of war-damaged Europe. Harriman left the Commerce Department to move to Paris as the European director of what was called the Economic Cooperation Administration, which administered the Marshall Plan. This is the president, Averell Harriman, and Dean Acheson at the signing of the Marshall Plan. Harriman was joined in Paris by his wife, Marie, who had forgotten, or at least forgiven, his wartime dalliance with Pamela Churchill. Like most people in America, Harriman had expected a Thomas Dewey victory in the 1948 election. And after Harry Truman's amazing upset, he openly coveted the position of Secretary of State, but that went to Dean Acheson instead. But Averell Harriman was still America's best-known diplomat, so Truman brought him back to Paris again in June 1950 as a special assistant. He arrived in Washington just in time for the outbreak of the Korean War and the political crisis that led to Truman's dismissal of General Douglas MacArthur. In late March 1952, Truman surprised the country by declining to run for another term. Harriman, who is now a lame duck, in turn surprised everyone by entering the presidential race as New York's favorite son. While his interest in elected office had apparently been brewing for some time, it turned out that political campaigning was not Averell Harriman's strong suit. He won only one of the Democratic presidential primaries using the not especially compelling slogan of, quote, a rich man's son who took the poor man's side. Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson eventually faced the highly popular Dwight D. Eisenhower, who took office as president in January 1953. For the first time in 2 decades, Averell Harriman was left with no role in government. He retreated to his office at Brown Brothers Harriman and took long skiing vacations in Sun Valley. But it turned out that a return to his more leisurely private life of his younger days no longer had an appeal for him, even though he was now past 60. In 1954, Harriman ran for and won the Democratic nomination for governor of New York. Ironically, the man he beat in the primary was Franklin D. Roosevelt Jr., the president's son. When over 5 million votes were cast in the general election, Harriman won by just 11,000, which was the closest race in New York State history. This is his official portrait as governor of New York. And then the year after his inauguration as government, he ran for president again with no greater success. And the Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson for a second time. He would, of course, turn into a second-time loser. Harriman's biographer later described his campaigning style this way, quote, "His exuberance was manufactured, his grin was frozen, and his glad-handing mechanical. He regularly forgot names, faces, and places, and he never mastered the trick of acting as if he remembered someone." That's not a recipe for a successful political candidate. This is Harriman running at the Democratic Convention in 1956. This year, his slogan was, "Harriman is the man." Not much more convincing, I think. His 4 years as governor were moderately successful, even though he faced a hostile Republican legislature. It turned out his biggest mistake was appointing his longtime friend Nelson Rockefeller to chair a state commission. Rocky promptly jumped into politics and became Harriman's Republican opponent in 1958. He walloped him in a landslide by over 500,000 votes. Here he is campaigning unsuccessfully with President Truman in 1958. Harriman was bitterly disappointed by this result and never ran for office again, even though he did ask to be called Governor Harriman for the rest of his life. But now that he was through worrying about the approval of voters, Averell Harriman was able to return to his real passion, international diplomacy. Unlike politics, it was a craft for which he was ideally suited. Harriman was 67 when he left the governor's mansion in Albany, but nonetheless was able to dedicate more than 2 decades of the rest of his life to public service. At a time when most of his contemporaries from the Roosevelt and Truman administrations had either retired or died, it was a remarkable accomplishment and left a powerful legacy. His first opportunity to return to service was in the administration of John F. Kennedy in 1961. Harriman, to his disappointment, was not considered for Secretary of State. That went to Dean Rusk, but he was appointed first an ambassador at large, then an assistant secretary for Far Eastern Affairs, and in April 1963, undersecretary for political affairs, which was the 3rd highest position in the State Department. This is an early picture of Harriman and President John Kennedy. He became involved in a myriad of international crises and negotiations, including settling a conflict in Laos and heading a US delegation back to Moscow in August 1963, where he successfully completed a landmark agreement with the Russians to ban nuclear testing. But more ominously, he encouraged the November 1963 coup, which deposed the Diem government in South Vietnam and was a stepping stone in America's nightmare war in that country. Harriman continued on in the administration of Lyndon Johnson, but the affinity he had with John F. Kennedy was not replicated in the new administration or with the new president. Averell and Marie Harriman remained close friends with Bobby and Ethel Kennedy, and that was a black mark in Lyndon Johnson's book. Harriman was pigeonholed and his influence diminished. Then, just 3 months after LBJ's sweeping November 1964 election victory, came news from London that signaled the end of an era. Winston Churchill was dead. When Averell Harriman had left the embassy in London in October 1946, the Labour government of Clement Attlee was then in its 2nd year. Labour brought a wave of change to Britain, national health insurance and the welfare state, as well as the nationalization of key industries. Winston Churchill by this time was 71, and the stress of war had taken a toll on him. Many of his friends, as well as his wife Clementine, hoped that he would slip into a well-deserved retirement. But Winston Churchill still wanted to be, in Teddy Roosevelt's words, quote, the man in the arena. So he dug in, determined to return to power. As it turned out, his standing in America was higher than ever, especially after he used a speech at a small college in Fulton, Missouri, to warn of the dangers of Soviet expansion and what he called the Iron Curtain that had descended across the continent. 5 years later, the British people, having grown tired of socialism, returned the Conservatives with a small majority, and Winston Churchill was once again Prime Minister. He served in that role until April 1955, despite suffering a serious stroke in 1953. His great ambition was to reconcile Russia and the West and deflect the risk of a nuclear catastrophe. But Eisenhower was cool to Churchill's idea of a summit meeting with the Russians, and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was vigorously opposed. Churchill was no fan of Dulles, calling him, quote, a bull who carries his own china shop around with him. Churchill finally retired, and in a rare break with precedent, the Queen personally came to attend the farewell dinner at number 10 Downing Street. Winston Churchill would live on for 10 years after his retirement. His health declined, and he lamented that the world had left him and the British Empire behind. He told his private secretary, Sir Anthony Montagu Brown, quote, I worked very hard all my life, and I have achieved a great deal, in the end to achieve nothing. History would, of course, show that that pessimistic verdict was quite wrong. When Winston Churchill died in 1965, Averell Harriman was deeply disturbed to find himself left off the list of the initial US delegation to the funeral. It reminded him of times during the war when FDR thought of excluding him from other important events. He finally sent a plaintive note to Lyndon Johnson, noting that he and Bernard Baruch were Churchill's oldest American friends, and saying, quote, it would mean so much to me if I could go to the funeral as a member of the American Party. LBJ did not attend himself and relented, and Averell Harriman accompanied Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Dwight Eisenhower to London. When they returned on the government plane to Washington, one of the other passengers was Pamela Churchill, now happily married to theater producer Leland Hayward. Not having spoken in 15 years, they talked for hours as they flew across the Atlantic. The following month, Averell Harriman was back at the White House, once again as an ambassador at large, but with limited access to the president and limited influence on important issues. But nevertheless, he loyally roamed from one foreign capital to another, always publicly supporting US policy despite his personal misgivings. At each stop, he defended American escalation in the Vietnam War, even though he worried, as he put it, the policy was, quote, applying a stick with no carrot. He had just turned 75, but all that jet lag did not seem to faze him. Harriman was encouraged by many of his friends to dissent from LBJ's Vietnam bombing policy, but he remained silent. He wanted to be on the inside of power, and he couldn't risk losing whatever influence he did have, or even worse, being shut out of government altogether. And then the Tet Offensive in Vietnam in January 1968 shook the American public to the core. On March 30th, Johnson announced a curtailment in the bombing of North Vietnam and offered to begin negotiations. He added, quote, I am designating one of our most distinguished Americans, Ambassador Averell Harriman, as my personal representative to such talks. Harriman's surprise at this new role was eclipsed by the stunning announcement at the end of the president's speech that he would not seek another term. Averell Harriman now had another coveted assignment, one that might ensure his reputation and his place in history even more than his mission to Britain in 1941. But it took a month to even agree on the location of the talks in Paris, and the mandate that Harriman and his deputy Cyrus Vance, later himself a Secretary of State, received from the president gave them almost no room to negotiate. The talks became an exercise in polemics, posturing, and propaganda. It was not the Harriman style of negotiating. Harriman spent 7 months in Paris, but the Americans and North Vietnamese couldn't agree on concessions for a complete cessation of bombing. Later, when the government of South Vietnam and the Viet Cong joined the talks, 10 weeks were spent arguing about the shape of the conference table. Meanwhile, the Nixon campaign secretly encouraged the South Vietnamese government to drag its feet, promising a more supportive stance if the Republicans took the White House. When Richard Nixon won the presidency on November 5th, 1968, all hope for successful negotiations disappeared. Harriman lingered in Paris for 2 more months, returning to Washington the day before the inauguration of the new president. The next day, a tired and dispirited Lyndon Johnson awarded Averell Harriman America's highest civilian award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Averell Harriman was now approaching 80 and never held official office again, but he remained involved in world affairs. In July 1971, shortly after his wife Marie's death, he reconnected with Pamela, herself recently widowed, at a dinner party at the Georgetown home, you won't be surprised to hear, of Washington Post publisher Kathleen Graham. The old attraction was instantly reignited, and they were married in September of that year. With Pamela as a brilliant hostess, invitations to their home on N Street in Georgetown became among Washington's most coveted, especially after Jimmy Carter became president in 1977. But the landslide election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 meant that there was no longer a role for a Democratic elder statesman, especially one who is now 89 years old, hard of hearing, and with fading eyesight. But even still, the Harrimans, especially Pamela, who was only 60, were not relegated to the sidelines. She had become an American citizen and a registered Democrat when she married Averell, telling him it was, quote, the best wedding present she could give to a man who seemed to have everything else. Pam was determined to help the Democratic Party recover, and with Averell's money, created a very effective political action committee, which of course was quickly nicknamed the Pam Pack. One of the politicians she mentored was a charismatic 34-year-old who was serving his first term as the governor of a small southern state. That soon seemed like a bad bet because the young man promptly lost his bid for re-election, and his career, most people thought, was unlikely to recover. Averell Harriman finally died in July 1986 at 94. His funeral in New York was attended by over 900 mourners, and the music included the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which had been played at Winston Churchill's funeral 21 years earlier. One of the pallbearers was the Prime Minister's grandson, who was also named Winston Churchill. Pamela lived for a decade after her husband's death. In November 1992, that Southern governor became the 42nd president of the United States, and Bill Clinton made Pamela Harriman American ambassador to France. The French president of the time, Jacques Chirac, described her as, quote, one of the best ambassadors since Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Pam died in Paris in 1997, age 76. And President Clinton sent Air Force One to bring her body back to Washington. She was buried next to Averell Harriman at Arden Farm, the Harriman's longtime family home. His tombstone there reads fittingly, quote, "Patriot, public servant, and statesman." And what happened to Kathleen Harriman? In 1947, she married another New York blue blood, Stanley Mortimer, whose father had been a founder of the Standard Oil Company. Nothing, of course, could compete with the excitement of Kathy's wartime years with her father in London and Moscow. But even while raising 3 sons, she remained a first-rate skier and a champion equestrian, riding 2 magnificent horses that had been a gift from Joseph Stalin. When she finally died, her New York Times obituary described her as, quote, "quietly accomplished throughout her life, and when she could be, graciously subversive." When she died at age 93 in 2011, her children were astonished to find a hidden set of leather-bound notebooks filled with newspaper clippings, letters, and dispatches from Moscow, along with her private personal photographs of the Yalta Conference. So let me finish with this thought. I've always felt that history is more interesting when it involves a bit of imagination. So use yours this way. Winston Churchill never came to Sun Valley, but I can't help thinking that during the long years that he and Averell Harriman spent together, especially in the difficult days of 1941 and 1942, that the name might have come up. So I can imagine a conversation like this. "Winston, this war is taking so much out of both of us. When it's finally over, how about if you and Clementine come on a painting holiday with me?" "That sounds great, Ave, but where would we go?" "Why don't you be my guest at a wonderful resort I built just a few years ago, the one I told you about. It's called Sun Valley, and it's in Idaho." "Wonderful, Ave. Let's do that. Is that very far from New York City?" So the next time you're at the Sun Valley Lodge, see if you can spot 2 elderly gentlemen sharing a beverage. Hopefully it'll be a glass of champagne. They'll be deep in conversation. One will have a patrician Northeast accent, and the other will sound like an English aristocrat. Listen in if you can, for there is much the world can learn today from Winston Churchill and Averell Harriman, and from their friendship. A friendship that helped to save the world in one of its darkest hours. So thank you for joining us this evening, and I'll turn it back to Kristen for your questions and comments.
Well, that was a remarkable talk, Lee. Thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
I noticed that our level of participation didn't drop at all. And usually, you know, people
Well,
have
that's good.
dinner, kids, or whatever, and people were just fascinated. So I'll encourage everyone to ask a question in the chat box. So while we're waiting for that, I have a question, a couple questions actually
Sure.
for you. What do you think it was that made Averell Harriman such an excellent diplomat?
Well, I think he had, he was not a good politician, as I pointed out,
Yes.
but he had some interpersonal skills. He had a self-confidence that he carried with him through his life. And he also had an ability and a willingness to take on positions that other people might have said were not as important as they deserved. So he had clearly, you know, the apogee of his diplomacy was clearly with Churchill during the early years of the Second World War. The failure of the Paris peace negotiations in 1968 certainly could not be laid at his feet, because no one could have successfully completed that. And it took another administration, a different Secretary of State to accomplish that. So he had some personal skills. Maybe it was from his aristocratic upbringing, a sense of noblesse oblige, perhaps. But I found it remarkable as I learned more about Harriman that he could serve his country so faithfully and in most cases effectively, well into his 80s. He was really one of the last survivors of that great era of the Second World War.
And you are writing a book right now about Churchill, is that correct? Could you tell us a little bit
Sure.
about what you're working on now?
Yeah. I don't claim to be a professional or academic historian, but I've given speeches about Churchill all around the country on all kinds of different subjects. I do one called Franklin and Winston, the Friendship That Saved the World, which inspired the title of the talk I did tonight. I do sort of left field things like Churchill at the movies, about all the films he's been portrayed in. So I have a whole bunch of different Churchill subjects. You never run out of interesting things to talk about when Winston Churchill's involved. So I'm going to collect all those. It's probably about 100,000 words now, because I have 12 or 15 different subjects, and I'll get it either published or self-published. And it's little vignettes about Churchill's life. I'm calling it Action This Day, which was a favorite exhortation of Churchill's during the war. And then the subtitle is Adventures with Winston Churchill, which is I used to be in the commercial real estate business, but hanging around with Winston Churchill is more fun. No question about that.
And then a question about something we touched on before, you and I touched on before we started, was I had a memory that Winston Churchill in a busy day could just find a comfy chair someplace and take a nap. And you said you laid out his normal day.
Yes.
Could you share that with folks? Because it was
of course.
fascinating.
Yeah. Well, Winston Churchill was a distinctive personality. He was not, what you call. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay. Winston Churchill was not what you would call a morning person. He would wake up at 8 o'clock. He'd have 10 or 12 of the British daily newspapers brought into him. He'd sit in his bed in his dressing gown, have a secretary take dictation of letters and memos and speeches, have a nice lunch in the early afternoon. He would then take an afternoon nap, and that was not put your head down on the desk for 15 minutes. He would sometimes get in his pajamas, get back in bed, and sleep soundly for an hour or two. That would be followed by almost always cocktails and an important dinner. And Churchill felt that the dining table was an instrument of diplomacy and political advancement, and used that very effectively. To be a guest at his dinner table would be a fascinating thing for anyone. And then when the evening was over, after brandy and cigars at 10 or 11, he would then get another secretary and work until 2 in the morning. He didn't type, he didn't write things in longhand, but he was very good at dictating. And he would prowl around, whether it was his bedroom or the living room, dictating to secretaries. There's a scene in The Darkest Hour movie with Gary Oldman from a couple of years ago that illustrated that. He would sleep very soundly, and then the same routine would be repeated the following day. It was very effective. He was an incredibly hardworking and effective political figure. He read things, he communicated with people, he focused both on grand strategy and on minute details. So that didn't make him an interesting person to be married to or to work for, or an easy person to be married to or work for, but it made him very effective.
And what would you say, I mean, given the remarkable life of both of these gentlemen, if you were to pick out one or even two of their most significant accomplishments as individuals, what would you point towards?
Well, in Churchill's case, he was asked somewhat later in life if he could live his life over again, what would be the thing he would like to relive? And he replied in a flash, 1940, of course, all over again. And 1940 was the year of Churchill's ascendancy to greatness. The night he became prime minister, at just the same day that the German blitzkrieg started to move through Belgium, France, and Holland, he wrote in his more memoirs that when he finally went to sleep at 3 a.m. the next morning, he said, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, that every past hour of my life had been but a trial for this task, and I felt I had been prepared and I would not fail." So for Churchill, that unique, even in adversity, that's what he wanted to relive. And to some degree, the rest of his life after 1940 and 1941, as great as it was, couldn't compare to that unique moment. And certainly in Averell Harriman's case, I think he probably, if he'd been asked, he probably would have said that was a unique period of time in his life to be present at such a pivotal moment in history, to experience it. A bomb could have dropped on the Dorchester Hotel and killed him. People sometimes comment on what seemed to be a unexpected degree of call it romantic flexibility, if that's a good term, in London during the Blitz. And certainly Averell Harriman and Pamela Churchill were an example of that. But if there's a chance you're going to die tomorrow, perhaps what you do tonight should be considered in the context of that. And certainly Harriman's time at Yalta and in the embassy in Moscow were important. But for both of them, that period of, say, from Churchill's case from May 10th, 1940, when he became prime minister, and Harriman's case from early 41 when he went to London, those few years were very exciting for both of them, as they were for almost everyone who lived through that period of time.
Well, thank you for that beautiful synopsis of their lives. And I just want to thank everyone here tonight. Thank you for joining us for this exceptional talk. And within a few days, you'll be getting an email from me with a video link so you can watch it again or share it with friends. It will also be posted on the Haley Public Library's website for later viewing. And I just invite you to keep your eyes open for other programs and presentations that we're offering. And Lee, thank you again very much for your time and your passion for this subject. It has been wonderful.
My pleasure. Thank you.